She teased the Korean Mafia boss as always, until he approached and imposed a rule she could not escape. On the quiet morning of November 15th, 2024, in the Korean town of Cheongsong, a foreign waitress saw her routine shatter over one unsettling detail. Someone knew her full name before she ever spoke it. Hours later, the one painting that carried her entire identity had been moved, as if unseen hands had crossed her doorway just to touch her past. And that day, a single line left on the floor altered everything. What truly began that morning? Follow the channel, like this video, and comment where you are watching from. The ceramic cup felt heavier than it should have in Alina Ward's hands, or maybe it was just the weight of everything else pressing down on her that made even the simplest tasks feel impossible. She dried it slowly, carefully, her dark fingers tracing the hairline crack that ran along its rim like a scar that refused to heal. The cup was still useful, still served its purpose, but one wrong move, and it would shatter completely. She understood that feeling more intimately than she cared to admit. The Sol de Manhin Café smelled like comfort she couldn't afford to feel. Freshly brewed coffee mixing with the sweet scent of hao de guaja from the bakery next door. Around her, customers sat in their small circles of normalcy, laughing about weekend plans, complaining about their mothers-in-law, sharing gossip about whose daughter got accepted to which university. Their lives seemed to flow like water, smooth and unremarkable, while hers felt like trying to swim upstream with stones tied to her ankles. Alina had moved to Cheongsong 8 months ago, running from debts and disappointments in Seoul that still followed her like shadows she couldn't outrun. This small city in North Gyeongsang province had seemed like salvation at first, quiet enough to disappear, close enough to civilization to survive. She'd found work at the cafe, a tiny studio apartment in Ukrim, and enough distance from her past to breathe. Or so she thought. The afternoon light filtered through the cafe's windows, casting golden patterns across the wooden tables. Outside, Ajumas walked by with shopping carts, their voices rising in animated conversation. A couple sat by the window sharing a single slice of cake, their fingers intertwined. Normal. Everything was so devastatingly normal for everyone except her. She didn't hear the door chime at first. Her mind had drifted somewhere between exhaustion and the careful maintenance of her smile, the one she wore for customers, for strangers, for anyone who might ask if she was okay. But she felt the shift in the air, that particular change in temperature that happened whenever he walked in. Han Jamin. For months, he'd been the strangest constant in her unstable life. Always the same order. Black coffee, no sugar, no cream. Always the same seat by the corner, where he could see the entire cafe without being noticed. Always the same carefully folded bills left on the table, just slightly more than necessary. Never enough to be insulting, but always enough to be noticed. And always, that playful tension between them. The way she'd ask if he wanted to finally try something sweet for once. The way he'd respond that some people don't need sugar to make life interesting. It had become their routine, their harmless game. She'd tease him about his serious expression. He'd counter with something witty about her persistent optimism in a world that clearly didn't deserve it. It was safe. It was predictable. It was the one interaction in her day that felt like she still had some control. But today, everything was wrong. Jamin walked to the counter with none of his usual ease. His movements were precise, measured, like someone approaching a situation that required careful handling. He wore the same dark coat he always did, perfectly tailored, the kind of clothing that whispered money without shouting it. His face was handsome in that distinctly Korean way. Sharp jawline, intense eyes, hair styled with just enough care to look effortless. But today, there was no hint of the slight smile that usually played at the corners of his mouth. The usual? Alina asked, trying to inject normalcy into her voice, trying to restart their familiar dance. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her with an intensity that made her hand freeze on the coffee pot. The other customers continued their conversations, oblivious, but in the space between Alina and Jamin, the world had gone silent. Alina Gabrielle Ward, he said quietly, his accent wrapping around her full name with careful pronunciation. We need to talk about the games you've been playing. The coffee pot nearly slipped from her grip. She'd never told him her middle name. She'd never told anyone in Cheongsong her full name. The application at the cafe had only asked for Alina Ward. Even her landlord only knew her as Ms. Ward. Her heart began hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape. "I don't," she started, but he raised one hand slightly, a gesture so small yet so commanding that her words died in her throat. "Not here," he said, glancing almost imperceptibly at the elderly couple 3 tables away, at the university student with headphones typing on her laptop, at the young mother trying to convince her toddler to eat his rice cake. "But you need to understand something before this goes any further." He leaned closer, not threateningly, but close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated, cedar and smoke, close enough that when he spoke, only she could hear. "Every smile you've given me, every joke, every moment you thought was just innocent fun between a waitress and a customer, the entire city has been watching, and they've drawn their own conclusions." Alina's mouth went dry. "What conclusions?" "That you belong to me," Jamin said simply, as if stating an obvious fact. "That I've claimed you. That anyone who bothers you would be bothering someone under my protection." He paused, and something flickered in his eyes. Was it regret? Warning? "And before you think I'm the one who spread that story, let me save you the trouble." He straightened up, adjusting his coat with one hand, his expression unreadable now, a mask of careful neutrality that somehow felt more frightening than anger would have been. "I didn't start the rumor, Alina, but someone did. Someone wanted people to believe you were mine. And now?" He looked toward the window, toward the street where 2 men stood across from the cafe, pretending to look at their phones but clearly watching the entrance. Now stopping it might be more dangerous than letting it continue. The cup in Alina's hand, the one with the crack, finally slipped from her trembling fingers. It shattered against the floor in a sound that seemed too loud, too final. The cafe fell silent. Every head turned toward her, the elderly couple, the student, the young mother, all of them staring. And in that moment, as she looked at their faces, Alina saw it. The recognition, the knowing glances, the way they looked at Jamin, and then at her, and then quickly away, like they'd known all along, like she was the only one who'd been living in ignorance. Jamin placed exact change on the counter, enough for coffee he hadn't ordered, hadn't drunk. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we talk about rules. Until then, go straight home. Don't stop anywhere. Don't talk to anyone you don't absolutely have to." He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at her one final time. "And Alina, whatever you do, don't try to run. People who run from shadows only discover they've been running toward something worse." The door chimed as he left. Through the window, she watched him walk past the 2 men across the street. They didn't follow him. They stayed exactly where they were, their eyes fixed on the cafe entrance, fixed on her. Inside, the elderly man was already kneeling beside her, carefully picking up pieces of broken ceramic. "Careful, Miss Ward," he said softly, not meeting her eyes. "Broken things can cut you if you're not careful how you handle them." His wife placed a gentle hand on Alina's shoulder, a gesture that felt less like comfort and more like condolence. And suddenly, Alina understood. The extra kindness from strangers, the way people had started treating her differently over the past few weeks, the respectful nods, the careful distances. She hadn't been making friends in this small city. She'd been marked, claimed, protected, by someone she'd thought was just a customer who liked his coffee black. The cafe closed early that evening. Mrs. Kang, the owner, had simply looked at Alina's trembling hands and pale face and told her to go home. No questions asked, no explanations required. Just a knowing look that said more than words ever could, the kind of look that made Alina wonder how long everyone around her had been keeping secrets she wasn't privy to. The walk from Sol de Manhunt to her studio apartment in Jukrim usually took 15 minutes, a route she'd memorized down to every crack in the sidewalk, every corner store, every Ajuma who sat outside selling roasted chestnuts. But tonight, those familiar 15 minutes stretched into an eternity of hyper-awareness. Every footstep behind her sounded too close. Every car that passed seemed to slow down just slightly. Every shadow felt like it was reaching for her. The autumn air had turned crisp, carrying the scent of grilling meat from the gopchang restaurants and the sweet smell of yakwa from the traditional bakeries preparing for chuseok. Normally, these smells comforted her, reminded her why she'd fallen in love with this small city despite everything. Tonight, they felt like a mockery, all this normalcy continuing around her, while her entire world had tilted off its axis. She turned onto Jukrim Row, the street where her building stood among a row of similar structures, all of them wearing that particular shade of aged Korean architecture, somewhere between cream and gray, with rust stains trailing from air conditioning units and laundry hanging from balconies like flags of ordinary life. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, number 302, a space so small she could touch both walls if she stretched her arms out, but it was hers. Or at least, it had felt like hers. That's when she noticed them. 2 people standing across the street, positioned under the broken streetlight that the building management had been promising to fix for months. They weren't doing anything obvious, just standing, talking to each other in low voices, occasionally glancing at their phones. But something about their posture was wrong. Too alert, too focused, like sentries disguised as civilians. Alina's heart began that terrible hammering again, the same rhythm it had found when Jamin spoke her full name. She fumbled with her keys, dropped them, picked them up with shaking fingers that suddenly felt too clumsy to function. When she looked up again, the 2 figures had turned completely toward her building, no longer pretending to be engaged in casual conversation. Their eyes met hers across the distance. Then, as if choreographed, they simply turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the Hanak-style restaurant at the end of the block. Gone. Vanished. Like they'd never been there at all. Alina stood frozen on the sidewalk, her keys cutting into her palm where she gripped them too tightly. Had she imagined it? Was paranoia finally claiming the last pieces of her sanity? But no. She could still see the impression of their shoes in the light dusting of fallen ginkgo leaves, still sense the disturbance their presence had left in the air. She ran up the 3 flights of stairs, her breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion, and everything to do with the fear clawing at her chest. The hallway smelled like someone's dinner, kimchi jjigae, the scent of fermented cabbage and pork mixing with gochugaru. Her neighbor's television blared a variety show, the sound of laughter and applause bleeding through thin walls. Her apartment door was open, not wide open, just slightly ajar, maybe 2 inches, enough to show the darkness inside, enough to make her stomach drop to somewhere around her knees. She always locked her door. Always. It was one of the habits she'd developed living in Seoul, one of the survival instincts that had kept her safe in a city that didn't care whether she lived or disappeared. Alina pushed the door open slowly, her hand trembling so badly she had to use both hands to control it. She expected chaos. Overturned furniture, scattered belongings, the television smashed, her few precious possessions destroyed. That's what break-ins looked like in movies, in stories, in the warnings her mother had given her before she'd moved to Korea. But inside, everything was exactly where it should be. The tiny kitchen area with its 2-burner stove and miniature refrigerator, untouched. Her futon, still folded in the corner with the lavender blanket her grandmother had sent from Atlanta, perfectly arranged. The stack of art supplies she used for her real passion, the painting she did late at night when the cafe shifts ended and sleep refused to come, organized exactly as she'd left them. Everything was in place, except for one thing, her favorite painting, the one she'd created during her first week in Cheongsong, a landscape of Juwangsan Mountain rendered in blues and purples that didn't quite match reality but captured how the place had made her feel, had been moved, just slightly, maybe 3 inches to the left. Not enough to be obvious vandalism, but enough to be noticed, enough to be a message. Someone had been here. Someone had touched her things. Someone had walked through her space with careful, deliberate hands, rearranging just enough to prove they could. Alina's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, her back against the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps that sounded too loud in the terrible silence of her violated sanctuary. That's when she saw it. A piece of white paper on the floor beneath where the painting had been, so perfectly placed it couldn't have fallen there by accident. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, the kind of penmanship taught in expensive Korean schools where calligraphy was still valued as an art form. He shouldn't have spoken to you that way. 7 words. 7 words that turned her blood to ice. Someone had been watching at the cafe. Someone had seen her conversation with Jamin. Someone had been close enough to hear, to judge, to disapprove. And that someone had access to her home, to her private space, to the one place she was supposed to be safe. Her phone rang, the sound so sudden and sharp in the silence that she actually screamed, a short, choked sound that embarrassed her even though no one was there to hear it. The screen showed no caller ID, just a blank space where a name or number should be. Every instinct told her not to answer. Every survival mechanism screamed to throw the phone across the room, to run, to call the police, to do anything except connect this call. But her hand moved anyway, bringing the phone to her ear, her voice barely a whisper when she spoke. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional, almost pleasant, the kind of tone a bank representative might use when calling about a credit card payment. Male, probably middle-aged, speaking Korean with the subtle accent of someone from Busan. "Miss Ward," the voice said, and the fact that he knew her name made her want to vomit. "We noticed you came home safely. That's good. We were worried. Who are you?" Alina managed to force the words out through a throat that felt like it was closing. "That's not important right now. What's important is that you understand your position. Mr. Han was careless today. He allowed emotion to compromise discretion. We can't have that happen again. I don't understand what any of this—" "Tomorrow," the voice interrupted gently, "you'll go to work as usual. You'll smile at customers. You'll serve coffee. You'll be the friendly American artist that everyone in Cheongsong has come to know." A pause. "And if Mr. Han approaches you again, you'll be polite. Distant, professional, nothing more. And if I don't?" The question came out before she could stop it, some last shred of defiance rising through the fear. The silence on the other end stretched for 3 heartbeats. 4. 5. "Miss Ward, we're not threatening you. We're protecting you. There's a difference. But protection only works when people follow the rules." Another pause. This one heavier, weighted with implication. "If you don't come to the cafe tomorrow, we'll assume you've chosen a different kind of protection. Mr. Han's kind. And that would complicate things for everyone involved." The line went dead. Alina sat on the floor of her apartment as the last light faded from the window, as the sounds of normal life continued around her. Televisions playing, neighbors cooking dinner, someone's child practicing piano scales. She sat there until her legs went numb, until the fear crystallized into something harder, something closer to determination. Someone had moved her painting. Someone had left a note. Someone had called to deliver a warning wrapped in the language of concern. And tomorrow, she would have to decide whose rules to follow, knowing that either choice might be the one that finally broke her, just like that cracked ceramic cup, into pieces too small to ever put back together. Sleep had been impossible. Alina had spent the night sitting by her window, watching the street below for shadows that moved wrong, for cars that stayed parked too long, for any sign that the invisible eyes watching her had manifested into something she could actually see and confront. But Jukrim Row remained stubbornly, terrifyingly normal. Just another quiet residential street in a small Korean city where nothing remarkable ever happened. By the time dawn broke over the mountains surrounding Cheongsong, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have inspired her to paint if her hands weren't still shaking, Alina had made her decision. She would go to the cafe, not because the voice on the phone had told her to, and not because she was afraid of what might happen if she didn't. She would go because running away had never solved anything in her life, and she was tired, so desperately tired, of being afraid. The morning air was cold enough to see her breath, crisp with the promise of winter creeping down from the northern mountains. She walked the familiar route to Seoul Damanha, her footsteps echoing off the shuttered storefronts that wouldn't open for another hour. The street vendors were just beginning to set up their carts. The ajumma who sold hotdog positioning her griddle, the old man who made bonjapang arranging his fish-shaped molds with the care of a craftsman who'd been doing the same thing for 40 years. They watched her pass with expressions she couldn't quite read. Concern, pity, knowledge of something she still didn't understand. The ajumma even called out, "Be careful today, Miss Ward," in Korean accented with the Gyeongsang dialect, and Alina wanted to stop, to ask what exactly she should be careful of, but her legs kept moving forward because stopping felt like admitting defeat. She reached Seoul Damanha 20 minutes before opening time. The cafe was dark, the chairs still upside down on tables from last night's closing routine, the espresso machine cold and silent. Alina had her own key. Mrs. Kang had trusted her with it after the 3rd month, a gesture that had felt like acceptance at the time, but now felt like another thread in a web she didn't know she'd been caught in. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and froze. Jamin was already there. He sat in his usual corner, but in the darkness of the unopened cafe, Without the buffer of other customers and the normalcy of business hours, his presence felt different, more solid, more undeniable. He wore a different coat today, charcoal gray instead of black, but the same careful attention to appearance, the same precise way of occupying space that suggested he was always aware of exactly where he was and who might be watching. "You're early," Alina said, her voice steadier than she expected. She didn't turn on the main lights, just the small lamp behind the counter, creating a pool of warm illumination that didn't quite reach the corners where shadows gathered. "So are you," Jamin replied. He stood slowly, gracefully, and moved toward the door she'd just entered through. For a moment, panic flared in her chest. Was he blocking her exit? But he simply reached past her and turned the lock with a soft click that sounded too final in the quiet space. "We don't have much time before Mrs. Kang arrives," he said, turning back to face her. "And there are things you need to understand before anyone else complicates this situation further." "Complicates?" Alina's laugh came out harsh, brittle. "Someone broke into my home yesterday. Someone called me with warnings about you. Someone has been taking pictures of me, spreading stories about me, treating me like I'm some kind of property that's been claimed. How exactly could this get more complicated?" Something flickered across Jamin's face. Regret, maybe, or something darker that she couldn't quite identify in the dim lighting. He reached into his coat pocket, and every muscle in Alina's body tensed. But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon or a threat. It was just a small white card, the kind of business card that professionals in Korea carried everywhere, essential as identification. He placed it on the counter between them. Alina looked down at it, her eyes adjusting to read the simple text printed in both Korean and English. "Rule 1. Stay where I can guarantee your safety." "I don't want your rules," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "I never asked for any of this." "I know." Jamin's voice was quiet, almost gentle, and somehow that made it worse. Anger she could fight against, threats she could resist, but this careful kindness, this tone that suggested he actually cared about her well-being, was harder to armor herself against. "But someone decided to involve you anyway, and now we're both dealing with consequences neither of us chose." He moved closer, not invading her space, but close enough that she could see the fine details of his face. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the shadow of exhaustion under his eyes, suggesting he'd slept as poorly as she had, the tension in his jaw that spoke of words he was carefully choosing not to say. "Yesterday, you asked who I was," he continued. "You've been serving me coffee for months, and never really asked. Most people in Cheongsong could have told you. Most people know better than to ask." "Then tell me now," Alina demanded. "Tell me what you are that makes people so afraid. Tell me why someone thinks I belong to you when I've never been anything more than polite. Tell me why my life is falling apart because I smiled at a customer." Jamin was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Alina heard all the sounds of early morning Cheongsong filtering through the cafe walls. A bus rumbling past, someone's scooter backfiring, the distant sound of the Buddhist temple bell ringing from Songni-san. "There are people in this city," he finally said, "who manage things that happen in the spaces between what's legal and what's necessary. They settle disputes that can't go to court. They provide protection to businesses that need it. They maintain order in ways the police can't or won't." Understanding crashed over Alina like cold water. "I manage interests," Jamin interrupted smoothly, "and someone decided that you were one of those interests. Not because of anything you did, not because you're actually important to me, but because you were visible. You were foreign, you were alone, and you were kind to me in a way that people noticed and misinterpreted." He picked up the card from the counter and held it out to her. "This isn't a threat, Alina. It's a shield. The people who broke into your apartment yesterday, who called you, who've been watching, they wanted to test something. They wanted to see if I would actually protect someone just because rumors said I would. They wanted to find a weakness. And did they?" Alina's voice was barely a whisper now. "Yes," Jamin said simply. "They found out that I can't stand by and watch innocent people suffer because of my reputation. They found out that you matter enough to me that I'll make it official rather than let you become a pawn in someone else's game." Alina stared at the card in his outstretched hand. "Rule 1. Stay where I can guarantee your safety." 7 words that would change everything. 7 words that would mean accepting protection she never asked for, entering a world she knew nothing about, tying her fate to a man she'd thought was just someone who liked his coffee black. "What if I refuse?" she asked. "What if I just leave Cheongsong, go back to Seoul, or go back to America?" The sadness in Jaemin's eyes was answer enough before he even spoke. "They'll follow you, or they'll hurt you to hurt me, or they'll use your absence to create chaos that damages people who have nothing to do with either of us. You stopped being invisible the moment someone decided to make you visible, Alina. And there's no going back from that." Outside, she heard Mrs. Kang's voice calling out a greeting to someone on the street, the sound of keys jingling as she approached the cafe. Time was running out for this conversation, for this moment of decision that felt too big for a dark cafe on an ordinary Thursday morning. "Before you decide," Jaemin said softly, urgently, "you need to know one more thing. The reason this started. The reason someone targeted you specifically." He paused, and the weight of what he was about to say seemed to physically press down on him. "Alina, you've been under observation since the first day you walked into this cafe. Since before you ever spoke to me. Since before you even moved to Cheongsong." The words didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. She'd chosen this city randomly, picked it off a map because it was small and quiet, and no one she knew had ever heard of it. "That's impossible," she breathed. "I wish it was," Jaemin said, and in his eyes, she saw the truth. Complicated, disturbing, and undeniable. The lock on the cafe door rattled as Mrs. Kang's key slid into place. The days that followed Jaemin's revelation moved like scenes from someone else's life. A movie Alina was watching rather than living, each moment feeling simultaneously hyper-real and completely disconnected from anything she understood as normal. She'd taken the card. She hadn't agreed to anything explicitly, hadn't signed any contracts or made any promises, but the small piece of paper now lived in her wallet like a talisman she didn't know whether to trust or fear. Rule 1. Stay where I can guarantee your safety. But safety, she was learning, came with a price she hadn't anticipated. The price of visibility, of being known in ways that made her skin crawl with the uncomfortable sensation of being perpetually observed. It started small, or maybe it had always been there, and she'd simply been too naive, too focused on surviving day to day, to notice the subtle shifts in how Cheongsong treated her. On Friday morning, she walked to the butcher shop on Dongbu Row to buy pork belly for her weekly meal prep, one of the few luxuries she allowed herself, the comfort of samgyeopsal cooked on her tiny portable grill while she painted late into the night. Mr. Huang, the butcher, was a man of few words, someone who'd always treated her with the baseline politeness reserved for any customer, but nothing more. He'd never asked about her life, never made small talk beyond confirming her order. But that Friday, everything changed. "Miss Ward," he said as she approached the counter, and his tone carried a warmth that hadn't existed before, a deference that made her pause mid-step. "I set aside the best cut for you this morning, the belly from the Jeju black pig, very special, usually reserved for regular customers only." He wrapped the meat with careful precision, his weathered hands moving with the expertise of someone who'd been cutting meat since before Alina was born. When she reached for her wallet, he waved her away with a gesture that was somehow both generous and final. "No charge today," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Consider it a gift, a welcome, you could say, even though you've been here many months already." He paused, then added in a lower voice, "It's good that someone is looking after you properly now. A young woman alone in a new country. It's not easy. We should have been more welcoming from the start." Alina wanted to refuse, wanted to insist on paying, but the expression on Mr. Huang's face stopped her. It wasn't just generosity. It was something closer to apology, or perhaps insurance, the look of someone making sure they were on the right side of an invisible line she hadn't known existed. She took the meat with trembling hands and mumbled thanks that felt inadequate for a transaction she didn't understand. The florist was next. Mrs. Song, who ran the small flower shop tucked between the pharmacy and the stationery store, had always been kind to Alina in that distant way that shop owners are kind to all customers. Once a month, Alina bought fresh flowers for her apartment, usually whatever was cheapest, whatever had been sitting too long and needed to be sold. Carnations past their prime, chrysanthemums with browning edges. Nothing special, nothing expensive. But when Alina walked in that afternoon after her shift at Solda Manha, Mrs. Song's entire demeanor had transformed. She rushed from behind the counter, her hands fluttering like the petals of the flowers surrounding her, and began pulling together an arrangement that made Alina's breath catch. White roses, pale pink peonies imported from somewhere expensive, baby's breath arranged with the kind of artistic care usually reserved for weddings or funerals. "For you," Mrs. Song said, her smile bright, but her eyes carrying that same knowing quality Alina had seen in Mr. Huang's face. "No charge. A gift between friends." "Mrs. Song, I can't. These must cost—" "Please," the older woman interrupted gently, pressing the bouquet into Alina's arms with a firmness that didn't allow for argument. "Let me do this small thing. You've brought light to our neighborhood, and light should be celebrated, don't you think?" She patted Alina's hand, her fingers cool and papery against Alina's skin. "Besides, it's good to show appreciation to those who are appreciated by important people." There it was again, that careful language, that implication of connection and consequence. Alina carried the flowers home, their scent filling her nostrils with a sweetness that felt wrong, tainted by the knowledge that these weren't gifts of genuine affection, but rather offerings of strategic alliance. People weren't being kind to her because they liked her. They were being kind because they were afraid of what might happen if they weren't. The realization made her want to cry, to scream, to throw the beautiful flowers into the street, and demand that everyone just treat her like a normal person again. But normal had become a luxury she could no longer afford. That evening, as she arranged the flowers in the only vase she owned, a cheap glass thing from Daiso that suddenly seemed too humble for such expensive blooms, her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. "Your friend Minho wants you to know the money is settled." Alina stared at the message, her heart beginning that familiar, anxious rhythm. Minho. She hadn't thought about him in months, had tried to forget about the money he'd borrowed during her first desperate weeks in Seoul, the 3 million won he'd promised to pay back within a month, and then disappeared with like smoke. 3 million won that had been one of the final straws pushing her out of Seoul and into Chongsong's supposed anonymity. She typed back with shaking fingers, "What are you talking about? Who is this?" The response came immediately. "Check your bank account. All debts cleared. You're welcome." Alina opened her banking app with a sense of dread so profound it made her nauseated. The screen loaded slowly, each second an eternity, and then there it was, a deposit. 3 million won. Exactly the amount Minho had taken. Deposited that morning from an account labeled simply, "Settlement Services." She sat down hard on her floor, the phone slipping from her nerveless fingers, her mind racing through implications she didn't want to face. Someone had found Minho. Someone had made him pay. Someone had access to her banking information, knew about her debts, knew about her private financial struggles. Someone was cleaning up her life without her permission, erasing her problems, making her obligations disappear, as if they'd never existed. Another message appeared. Other matters also resolved. You can stop worrying now. Other matters. What other matters? What else had they fixed, manipulated, erased from her life while she slept, while she worked, while she'd been living in ignorant bliss, thinking her struggles were her own private burden to bear? A knock on her door made her jump so violently she bit her tongue. She approached on silent feet, peered through the peephole, and saw her neighbor from across the hall, young Mr. Park, a university student who'd never spoken to her beyond polite nods in passing. She opened the door a crack, every muscle tense. "Miss Ward," he said, looking uncomfortable, his eyes darting everywhere except directly at her face. "I wanted to apologize. Last month, when you asked to borrow my phone charger because yours broke, I said no. I was rude. I'm sorry. If you ever need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." He bowed, a deep formal bow that seemed excessive for such a minor past interaction, and retreated to his apartment before she could respond. Alina closed her door and locked it, then slid down until she was sitting with her back against the wood, her knees pulled to her chest. Around her, the apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in with the weight of invisible observation. They knew everything. Everyone knew everything. Her debts, her struggles, her past humiliations, her small rejections and minor cruelties. And now, like a fairy tale gone wrong, all of it was being retroactively corrected, smoothed over, fixed by hands she couldn't see, directed by motives she couldn't trust. Her phone buzzed one more time, Another unknown number. Another message that would change everything. She picked it up, her hands steadier now with a kind of resigned acceptance, and read, "You need to decide whose help you accept, Miss Ward. Not all gifts come from the same source. And some gifts have prices that won't be clear until it's too late to refuse payment." Attached to the message was a photo. Grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough to make her blood run cold. It was her, walking down Jukram Row 3 days ago. But she wasn't alone in the frame. Behind her, carefully maintaining distance but unmistakably present, were 2 figures she recognized from that first terrifying night. The 2 people who'd stood across from her building, watching. They'd been following her. Not just that night. For days, maybe weeks, maybe since the moment she'd arrived in Cheongsong, and someone else had been watching them watch her. By the time Sunday arrived, Alina had stopped trying to make sense of the invisible architecture surrounding her life. She'd spent Saturday locked in her apartment, ignoring the knocks from neighbors suddenly concerned about her well-being, declining calls from Mrs. Kang asking if she was sick, letting the world spin without her, while she sat among those expensive flowers, and tried to reconstruct the moment everything had gone wrong. But isolation solved nothing. And on Sunday evening, as the sun began its descent behind Juangsan Mountain, and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with painting in the first place, Alina made a decision. She would confront Jaemin, not at the cafe, where Mrs. Kang's worried eyes and the customers' knowing glances created an audience she couldn't bear, not through phone calls or messages that could be intercepted, monitored, misunderstood. She would find him and demand the truth. All of it. The parts he'd been carefully avoiding, the explanations he'd been rationing out like precious resources. She knew where to find him. Everyone in Cheongsong knew, even if they pretended not to. The building on Junggang Row, 3 blocks from the traditional market, where the first floor housed a legitimate consulting firm, but the upper floors remained mysteriously unoccupied according to official records. She'd walked past it dozens of times, never thinking much about the men in expensive suits who came and went, never questioning why such a modest building warranted a security guard stationed discreetly near the entrance. Now, as she stood across the street watching those same men move with purposeful efficiency, she understood. This was the heart of whatever network Jaemin managed. This was where decisions were made, where problems were solved, where people like her became chess pieces in games they didn't know were being played. The security guard noticed her immediately. Of course he did. She was standing in the middle of the sidewalk staring at the building like a tourist who'd lost her map. He spoke into a radio, his eyes never leaving her face, and Alina felt her courage beginning to waver. Maybe this was stupid. Maybe confronting Jaemin on his own territory was exactly the kind of reckless decision that got people hurt in ways that couldn't be undone. But before she could turn away, before she could retreat into the safety of ignorance and passive acceptance, Jaemin himself appeared at the building's entrance. He wasn't wearing his usual careful business attire. Instead, he'd dressed down. Dark jeans, a simple black sweater, a leather jacket that made him look younger, more approachable, almost like a normal person instead of whatever he actually was. He crossed the street with long strides, purpose in every movement, and Alina found herself rooted to the spot, unable to run even though every instinct screamed that she should. "You shouldn't be here," he said when he reached her, his voice low and urgent. Not angry, but genuinely concerned in a way that made her chest tighten with confusion. "This street has cameras. People will see you coming to find me, and they'll draw conclusions that make this situation even more complicated." "I don't care about their conclusions anymore," Alina said, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded, how the fear had crystallized into something harder, something closer to determination. "I want answers, Jaemin. Real answers. Not careful half-truths and strategic omissions. I want to know why my debts are being paid. I want to know who's following me and who's following them. I want to know why you said I've been watched since before I even moved here. And I want to know what you're actually protecting me from." Jaemin looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his dark eyes. Then he glanced up at the building behind him, at the security guard who was definitely still watching, and made a decision. "Not here," he said. "Walk with me." They walked in silence through the streets of Cheongsong as evening settled over the city like a blanket. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting pools of yellow illumination across sidewalks where ajumas hurried home with grocery bags, where teenagers gathered outside the PC Bang laughing about something on their phones, where life continued in all its mundane beauty, completely oblivious to the tension crackling between two people who didn't quite know how to exist around each other anymore. Jaemin led her to the small park near Songso Reservoir, where weeping willows draped their branches over still water, and the sound of the city faded to a distant hum. A few elderly people practiced Tai Chi in slow, graceful movements. A couple sat on a bench sharing convenience store kimbap. Normal people doing normal things in a normal place. "I can't tell you everything," Yamin said finally, stopping near a bench but not sitting, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. "Not because I don't want to, but because some information makes you complicit just by knowing it, and you're already too involved in something you never should have been part of. Then tell me what you can," Alina pressed. "Start with why you said I've been watched since before I moved here. That's not something you say by accident, Jimin. That's specific. That's intentional." He was quiet for so long, she thought he might refuse to answer. A cool breeze rippled across the reservoir, carrying the scent of water and earth and the faint smell of someone grilling meat nearby. Somewhere, a child laughed, the sound bright and pure and achingly normal. "There's a man," Jimin said slowly, carefully, like he was navigating a minefield with every word. "Someone who has interests in multiple cities across Korea. He doesn't work for me. We're parallel, I suppose you could say. We manage different territories, different concerns. Usually we avoid each other's business. Usually there's no reason for our paths to cross. But," Alina prompted when he paused, "but he's been trying to expand into Cheongsong for the past year. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would cause open conflict. Just small moves, strategic placements, testing boundaries." Jamin's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his temple. "One of his strategies has been to create complications in my operations. Make me look weak. Make it seem like I can't maintain order in my own territory." Understanding began to dawn, cold and terrible. "And I'm a complication. You were supposed to be," Jamin confirmed. "He learned about you when you were still in Seoul. Found out about your debts, your situation, your plans to move somewhere smaller. And he saw an opportunity." "To do what?" Alina's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "To plant someone in Cheongsong who could be used as leverage against me later. Someone foreign, vulnerable, someone who would naturally stand out and attract attention. Someone I might feel compelled to protect if circumstances aligned correctly." Jamin finally looked at her, and the regret in his eyes made her stomach twist. "You weren't chosen randomly, Alina. You were researched, vetted, guided here through suggestions and opportunities that felt like your own choices but weren't." The world tilted. The park, the water, the normal people doing normal things, all of it blurred around the edges as Alina processed what he was telling her. Her decision to leave Seoul, to choose Cheongsong specifically, to find the cafe job, to build a life here. None of it had been hers. All of it had been manipulation disguised as fate. "The cafe owner," she managed to say through the tightness in her throat. "Mrs. Kang. Was she—" "No," Jamin said quickly. "Mrs. Kang is exactly who she appears to be. But the job posting you saw online, the apartment listing that seemed perfectly affordable, the friend of a friend who suggested Cheongsong as a good place for foreign artists," he shook his head. "Those were engineered. You were herded here like—" He stopped himself, but Alina finished the thought in her own mind. "Like prey, like a lamb being led to slaughter, like a tool that didn't know it was being sharpened for use." A car drove past slowly, too slowly, and Jamin immediately moved closer to her, positioning himself between Alina and the street. The gesture was protective, instinctive, and probably meant to be comforting, but all it did was remind her how much danger she was in, how little control she'd ever actually had. The car continued past, just another vehicle in the evening traffic. But Jamin didn't relax. "When you first came into the cafe," he said quietly, "I already knew who you were. I'd been warned about you, told that you were bait meant to test my responses. I was supposed to ignore you, treat you like any other customer, not engage, not protect, not care." His voice roughened slightly. "But you were you smiled at everyone like the world hadn't tried to break you. You painted mountains at midnight because beauty mattered more than sleep. You were kind for no reason, expecting nothing in return. So you decided to care anyway," Alina said, "and it wasn't quite a question." "So I made a mistake," Jamin corrected. I let myself see you as a person instead of a strategy, and now both of us are paying for that mistake. If something happens to me, Alina said, remembering his words from before, people will blame you. Yes, Jameen said simply. And if I protect you too obviously, they'll say I'm weak. And if I ignore you, innocent people get hurt trying to use you as leverage. There's no good option, Alina. There's only choosing which damage to accept. She should have been angry, should have raged at him, at the faceless man who'd manipulated her life, at the entire system that treated people like game pieces. But standing there in the cooling evening air, watching Jamin struggle with truths he'd never meant to reveal, all she felt was tired and trapped, and wondering if there was any version of her future that belonged to her anymore. What do we do now? She asked. Jamin looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain. I don't know, he admitted. But whatever happens next, Alina, I need you to understand something. He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. If something goes wrong, if I can't protect you the way I want to, it won't be because I didn't try. It'll be because the situation was impossible from the start. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't a promise. It was just honesty, raw and painful, and more valuable than any false reassurance could have been. And somehow, that made everything worse. The week following Jamin's revelations passed in a haze of hyper-awareness that left Alina exhausted in ways sleep couldn't fix. Every interaction became a puzzle she needed to solve. Was the customer who complimented her coffee genuinely kind, or were they checking to see if she was still under Jamin's protection? Was the delivery driver who smiled too warmly just friendly, or was he reporting her movements to someone? The paranoia had grown roots in her mind, spreading like invasive vines that choked out any possibility of peace. She'd started noticing things she'd been blind to before. The way certain people would enter the cafe, order nothing, sit for exactly 10 minutes while pretending to read their phones, then leave. The pattern repeated every day. Different people, but same routine. Surveillance dressed up as normalcy. She recognized some faces now, could predict when they'd arrive, could feel their eyes tracking her movements as she wiped tables and refilled sugar containers. Cheongsong, which had once felt like sanctuary, now felt like a stage where she was the unwitting performer in a play whose script she'd never been given. Every street corner held potential watchers. Every parked car could contain someone taking notes. Every casual conversation might be mined for information she didn't know she was giving. On Thursday afternoon, during the slow hours between lunch and dinner rush, a woman walked into Solda Manha who made every instinct Alina had developed scream danger. She was maybe 40, dressed in the kind of understated elegance that whispered old money. Silk blouse and cream, tailored slacks, minimal jewelry that was probably worth more than Alina made in 6 months. Her hair was cut in a precise bob that framed a face that might have been beautiful if it weren't so carefully controlled, every expression managed like a corporate presentation. She sat at the table nearest the counter, Jamin's usual spot, and that detail alone made Alina's hands shake as she approached with a menu. "What can I get you?" Alina asked, keeping her voice professionally pleasant, despite the warning bells clanging in her head. The woman looked up, and her eyes were sharp in a way that made Alina think of surgical instruments, precision tools designed to cut cleanly. "Just coffee. Black. No sugar." Jamin's order. Exact, deliberate, intentional. As Alina prepared the coffee, she felt those sharp eyes tracking every movement, cataloging, assessing, judging. The espresso machine hissed and gurgled, filling the silence that had fallen over the cafe. Even the other customers seemed to sense something was happening. Conversations dropping to whispers, attention subtly shifting toward the woman who radiated authority, like heat from pavement in summer. When Alina placed the coffee on the table, the woman spoke without looking at her. "You're very trusting, Miss Ward. It's admirable. Also extremely dangerous." Alina's blood went cold. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" "No," the woman said, finally meeting her eyes with a smile that didn't reach past her lips. "But I know you. I know that you came to Korea with $17,000 in debt. I know your mother calls every Sunday at 9 p.m. your time, and you always tell her everything is fine, even though it isn't. I know you paint at night because insomnia has been your companion since you were 19. I know the real reason you left Atlanta had nothing to do with art opportunities and everything to do with a man who made promises he never intended to keep." Each detail landed like a slap. intimate violations delivered in a tone of casual conversation. Alina felt her face burning, humiliation mixing with fear in a toxic combination that made her want to run, to scream, to do anything except stand there absorbing this stranger's invasive knowledge of her life. "Who are you?" Elena managed to ask, her voice barely steady. "Someone who wants to help you understand your situation more clearly than Mr. Han has been willing to." The woman took a sip of her coffee, made a small approving sound. "He's told you that you're caught between competing interests, that you were brought here as part of someone else's strategy, that protecting you makes him look weak while abandoning you makes him look cruel. How do you— What he hasn't told you," the woman continued as if Alina hadn't spoken, "is that he's been making decisions about your life without consulting you for weeks now. The debts that disappeared, he paid them. The people who suddenly started treating you better, he spread word that you were under his direct protection. The job offers you've been getting from other cafes, better paying positions, he blocked every single one because keeping you at Sol de Manhã makes you easier to monitor." The words hit like physical blows. Alina gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles going white. "That's not— He wouldn't he?" The woman's eyebrow arched delicately. "Ask yourself, Miss Ward, how many choices you've actually made for yourself since arriving in Cheongsong. How many doors have opened and closed without your input? How many times has Mr. Han presented you with situations that were already decided, giving you the illusion of choice while controlling every variable?" Alina's mind raced back through the past weeks. The card with Rule 01. The careful explanations that always came after actions were already taken. The way Jamin had said, "Some decisions were made before you even knew my name." She'd interpreted it as other people making decisions, external forces moving pieces. But what if— "He's not your protector," the woman said softly, almost gently, like a teacher explaining something to a struggling student. "He's your handler. The difference matters, even if the end result looks similar from your perspective." "Why are you telling me this?" Alina demanded, anger finally breaking through the shock. "What do you want from me?" The woman stood, placing exact change on the table, the same amount Jamin always left, down to the one. "I want you to ask him the right questions. Not why is this happening, but when did you decide this for me? Not who's behind this, but what decisions have you made that I don't know about?" She adjusted her purse with practiced elegance. "And most importantly, ask him what happens when you're no longer useful as a pawn, but too dangerous to leave as a free variable." She walked toward the door, then paused, looking back with something that might have been genuine sympathy flickering across her controlled features. "One more thing, Miss Ward. The apartment next to yours, the one that's been empty since you moved in, it was rented 3 days ago. The tenant moved in yesterday while you were working. Quiet man, keeps odd hours. I'm sure it's just a coincidence." The door chimed as she left, and Alina stood frozen in place as the implications crashed over her like waves. Someone living next door, listening through thin walls, hearing her conversations, her phone calls, the sounds of her painting late at night. Another layer of observation, another invasion of the tiny private space she'd thought was hers. That evening, she stood in her apartment and stared at the wall she shared with Unit 301. She could hear movement on the other side, footsteps, the sound of furniture being arranged, the low murmur of a voice on the phone. Normal sounds, innocent sounds, sounds that made her skin crawl with the knowledge that nothing in her life was innocent anymore. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jamin. "Need to talk. Important. Can I come by?" Alina stared at the message, the woman's words echoing in her mind. "How many choices have you actually made? What decisions has he made that you don't know about?" She typed back, "No. We talk on my terms. Tomorrow. The reservoir. Noon." For the first time since this nightmare began, she was setting the conditions, making a demand instead of accepting arrangements made for her convenience. It was a small rebellion, maybe meaningless in the grand scheme of whatever game was being played, but it was hers. The response came quickly. "Okay, I'll be there." No argument, no insistence on his way, just acceptance that felt almost like respect, or maybe like someone who knew they'd been caught and was preparing their defense. Alina looked around her small apartment, the flowers she hadn't asked for, the debts paid without her consent, the life that had been managed and manipulated while she'd been too naive or too desperate to see the strings attached to every gift. Tomorrow she would get answers, real answers. Not the careful half-truths Jamin had been feeding her, but the complete picture he'd been hiding behind concern and protection and carefully constructed explanations. Tomorrow, she would find out if she'd ever had any control at all, or if she'd been a puppet from the moment she'd stepped foot in Cheongsong. And the thought that terrified her most was that she already knew the answer. Alina didn't sleep that night. She sat at her tiny table with old financial documents spread before her like evidence at a crime scene. Bank statements from her last months in Seoul, the lease agreement for her Cheongsong apartment, receipts from her first weeks in the city. She'd kept everything, a habit born from years of never knowing when she might need to prove something, to defend herself against accusations she couldn't predict. Now, looking at these documents with eyes opened by suspicion, she saw patterns that shouldn't exist. The apartment deposit, exactly the amount she'd had in her account after selling everything in Seoul, not a one more or less. The timing of the cafe job posting, appearing online the same day she'd searched for work in Cheongsong, as if someone had been waiting for that exact search. The friend of a friend, who'd recommended the city, a contact so distant she couldn't even remember their real name now, just a Facebook message that had seemed like serendipity at the time. But serendipity didn't leave paper trails this precise. Luck didn't align this perfectly. She found something else too, something that made her hands shake so badly she had to put down the papers. A payment record from 3 months ago, buried in her transaction history, a refund for administrative fees she'd never been charged in the first place. 200,000 won, deposited from an account listed simply as Cheongsong Municipal Services. Except when she searched online, there was no such department. No municipal office used that exact name. The account was a ghost, money appearing from nowhere to cover expenses she'd struggled with, making her life just stable enough to stay, but never quite comfortable enough to leave. The control had been that thorough, that complete. Every aspect of her existence in Cheongsong had been managed like a garden being carefully tended, not for her benefit, but for someone else's harvest. At 4 a.m., unable to bear the suffocating feeling of her apartment's walls any longer, Alina did something reckless. She opened the old files on her laptop, the ones she'd kept from her Seoul days, but never looked at because they hurt too much. Photos, mostly. Her art school friends, her ex-boyfriend Marcus, whose promises had evaporated like morning mist, the gallery showing she'd been so proud of before everything collapsed. And there, buried in a folder labeled MISC 2024, she found something that stopped her heart. A photo from a networking event she'd attended 6 months before moving to Cheongsong. She was in the background, barely visible, talking to a gallery owner who'd expressed vague interest in her work. But in the foreground, clear as day, stood 2 men in conversation. One was unfamiliar. The other was Jamin, in Seoul. 6 months before she'd moved to Cheongsong, before she'd ever heard of the city, before Seoul Damanhun and black coffee and carefully calibrated protection. Her vision blurred. The timestamp on the photo was undeniable. March 15th, 2024. She'd moved to Cheongsong in late August, which meant Jamin had been in Seoul, potentially aware of her existence, months before their first meeting in the cafe. Everything he'd told her about learning of her when she arrived, about discovering she was part of someone else's strategy, only after she'd settled in Cheongsong, all of it was lies. Or at best, carefully edited versions of truth designed to make him look reactive instead of complicit. The sun rose over a truth Alina didn't want to face, but could no longer avoid. By the time she needed to leave for the reservoir, she'd constructed a timeline in her mind that made her sick with its implications. Jamin hadn't been protecting her from someone else's plan. He'd been managing his own. The walk to Songso Reservoir felt like marching toward execution. The autumn morning was beautiful, crisp air carrying the scent of chrysanthemums from someone's garden, leaves turning gold and red on the mountains surrounding the city, the kind of morning that would have inspired her to paint if her hands weren't shaking with rage and betrayal. Jamin was already there, standing near the same bench where they'd talked before. He looked different today. Tired, maybe, or stressed. The careful composure he usually maintained had cracks in it, visible in the tightness around his eyes, the way his hands were shoved deep in his coat pockets like he was physically restraining himself. "You were in Seoul," Alina said, without preamble, without greeting, her voice flat and cold. "March 15th, 6 months before I moved here. I have a photo." The color drained from Jamin's face so quickly, She thought he might actually be sick. He opened his mouth, closed it, seemed to struggle with words in a way she'd never seen from him before. Alina, don't. She cut him off, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. Don't say my name like we're friends. Don't use that tone like you care. Just tell me the truth. Were you there, in Seoul, before all of this started? The silence that followed felt eternal. A jogger ran past, earbuds in, oblivious. Ducks paddled in the reservoir, their movements creating small ripples that spread across the still water. Normal life continuing while Alina's world fractured beyond repair. Yes, Jaemin finally said, the word barely audible. I was there. Why? The question came out as almost a whisper, all her anger collapsing into something that felt more like grief. Why were you in Seoul? Why at that event? Why? Her voice broke. How long have you been lying to me? I haven't. He stopped himself, seemed to recalibrate. I've been withholding information. There's a difference. Is there? Alina's laugh was bitter, broken. Because from where I'm standing, being lied to and being strategically uninformed feel pretty much the same. Jaemin looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Regret, maybe, or calculation, or some combination that made him look more human and more dangerous simultaneously. The situation is more complicated than you understand. Then uncomplicate it, Alina demanded. Start from the beginning, the real beginning, not the sanitized version you've been feeding me. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the reservoir like the water might hold answers he didn't want to voice. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, the tone of someone confessing sins they'd convinced themselves were necessary. I was in Seoul tracking the movements of the man I told you about, the one trying to expand into Cheongsong. He'd been recruiting people, identifying potential assets. You were at that networking event because someone in his organization had flagged you as... He paused, choosing his words with visible care. As useful. Foreign, talented but struggling. Vulnerable enough to be moved with the right incentives. So you what? Alina's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. Decided to recruit me first? To get to me before he could? No, Jaemin said firmly. I decided to monitor the situation, to see if his interest in you was serious or just exploratory, to understand what he was planning before making any moves myself. And then you made the decision to leave Seoul on your own. I didn't influence that. But when I saw you were researching smaller cities, when I saw Cheongsong appear in your search history, he stopped, and the guilt on his face told her everything she needed to know. You made sure I chose it, Alina finished, her voice dead. You created the job posting. You arranged the apartment. You constructed an entire life for me and convinced me it was my choice. I made sure you had safe options, Jaemin corrected, but the defense sounded weak even to him. I made sure that if you came here, you'd be somewhere I could actually protect you, instead of being isolated and vulnerable in his territory. Protect me, Alina repeated slowly. Is that what you call this? Manipulating every aspect of my existence? Paying my debts without asking? Controlling who hires me? Moving someone into the apartment next to mine to spy on me? Her voice cracked. That's not protection, Jaemin. That's ownership. It's survival, he shot back. And for the first time, real emotion broke through his control. Frustration. Fear. Something raw that made him look almost desperate. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I enjoy having to micromanage your life to keep you safe? Every decision I've made, every intervention, has been to prevent you from becoming a casualty in a conflict you should never have been part of. But I am part of it, Alina shouted, no longer caring who might hear, who might be watching. I've been part of it since that networking event, maybe before. And instead of telling me the truth, instead of giving me information I could use to protect myself, you've kept me in the dark like a child who can't be trusted with her own safety. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Then again. Then a third time in rapid succession. Jaemin's phone did the same, and the look that crossed his face made Alina's anger evaporate into pure fear. He pulled out his phone, his face going pale as he read whatever messages had arrived. When he looked up at her, his expression had transformed from guilty to something approaching panic. We need to leave, he said urgently. Right now. What? Why? Because someone just sent me photos, Jaemin said, his voice tight. Of us. Here. From 3 different angles. With a message. He turned his phone toward her, and Alina read the text displayed below, images of them standing at the reservoir, clearly arguing, clearly in the middle of a confrontation that looked personal, intimate, important. Decisions are being made, Mr. Han. Some of them will affect Miss Ward more than you can protect her from. We'll be in touch soon to discuss new arrangements. Below that, another message. This one directed at both of them based on the group chat header. Miss Ward, you should know that Mr. Han isn't the only one who's been making decisions about your future. Before you decide whether to trust him, there's one last thing you need to hear, and it might change everything you think you understand. They didn't leave the reservoir immediately, despite Jimin's urgency. Alina refused to run anymore, refused to be herded from place to place like livestock, while invisible forces made decisions about her safety, her future, her life. Instead, she sat down on the bench with a finality that made it clear she wasn't moving until she got answers. Real ones. Complete ones. The kind that came without strategic omissions or careful word choices designed to protect her from truths she deserved to know. Jamin stood for a moment, clearly torn between his instinct to extract them from a compromised location and his recognition that pushing Alina right now would shatter whatever fragile trust still existed between them. Finally, he sat beside her, maintaining a careful distance that felt more like a chasm than the few inches of physical space. "Tell me everything," Alina said, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her hands, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs like something trying to escape a cage. "Not the edited version. Not the parts you think I can handle. Everything." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the reservoir. An elderly woman fed breadcrumbs to the ducks, humming a song that sounded like something from the Korean War era. Somewhere across the water, children laughed as they played near the playground, life continuing in all its oblivious normalcy, while Alina's world restructured itself around revelations she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. "The man I've been protecting you from," Jamin began, his voice low and controlled in that way she now recognized as his default when delivering information he'd rather not share. "His name is Kang Min-seok. He controls operations in Seoul, Busan, and several smaller cities in between. He's been trying to expand into Gyeongsangbuk-do for years, but this region has always been complicated. Too many established interests. Too many people who've maintained balance for too long to accept disruption easily. And you're one of those established interests," Alina said. Not a question. A statement of fact she'd already pieced together. "Yes. My family has maintained order in Cheongsong and the surrounding areas for 3 generations. We don't deal in anything that actively harms people. No substances, no exploitation, nothing that destroys communities. We manage disputes, provide protection, ensure that business operates smoothly for those who can't rely on official channels." He paused, gauging her reaction. "I know how that sounds. I know it's still not legal, not legitimate in ways that matter to people like you. But there are degrees of wrong, Alina, and we've always stayed on the lesser side." "Very noble," Alina said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "So Kang Min-seok wanted your territory, and somehow I became relevant to that conflict. Explain how." Jamin's jaw tightened, that muscle jumping near his temple in a way she'd learned meant he was accessing information he'd rather keep buried. 6 months ago, Min-seok learned something about me, something personal. Something that could be used as leverage if he found the right pressure point. Alina turned to look at him fully, studying his profile as he stared determinedly at the water. "What did he learn?" "That I'm tired," Jamin said quietly, and the honesty in those 3 words was more startling than any revelation about criminal networks or territorial disputes. "That I've been managing this life since I was 23 years old when my father had a stroke and couldn't continue. That I've spent a decade making decisions I hate, protecting people who don't deserve protection, compromising my own values to maintain something I inherited but never wanted. That I've been looking for a way out that doesn't destroy everything my family built or leave vulnerable people without the protection they've come to depend on." He finally looked at her, and the exhaustion in his eyes was so profound it made her chest ache despite her anger. "Min-seok learned that I'm one bad day away from walking away from all of this, and he decided that the fastest way to create that bad day was to give me something I'd actually want to protect, something that would make me compromise my principles, make mistakes, show weakness to the people who depend on my strength." Understanding crashed over Alina like ice water. "Me? I'm the thing you'd want to protect." "Not initially," Jamin said. "Initially, you were just a variable he was positioning. But then I saw you at that networking event, heard you talking about your art with this light in your eyes despite everything you'd been through. Heard you tell that gallery owner that you painted because beauty mattered even when everything else didn't. And I realized Min-suk had chosen better than he knew. You weren't just a strategic asset. You were exactly the kind of person who would make me remember why I wanted to be better than what this life requires. Alina didn't know how to process that. Didn't know whether to be moved by the admission or furious that her fundamental humanity had been weaponized against both of them. So what happened? Why did you help me move here instead of just, warning me? Telling me to stay away from Cheongsong? Because Min-suk would have found another way to use you, Jaemin said. If you'd stayed in Seoul, you'd have been in his territory with debts he could buy, vulnerabilities he could exploit. No protection from someone who actually cared whether you survived the experience. At least here, in Cheongsong, I could control the variables. I could make sure your debts were cleared before he could purchase them. I could ensure you had stable work, safe housing, a community that would look out for you whether they knew why or not. You could control me, Alina corrected, and the words landed between them like stones dropping into still water. Yes, Jaemin admitted after a painful pause. I could control the situation, which meant controlling aspects of your life, and I knew it was wrong. I knew every intervention was a violation of your autonomy. But the alternative was leaving you genuinely vulnerable to someone who wouldn't hesitate to hurt you in ways I can't even articulate, without making you afraid to sleep at night. Alina's phone buzzed again. Another message, this time with an attachment. She opened it with hands that had moved past shaking into a strange kind of numbness. It was a document. Old, scanned from physical paper, the edges yellowed with age. A birth certificate. Korean, dated 28 years ago. The name on it made her blood run cold. Han Jaemin. But there was another detail, one that took her several readings to fully comprehend. Listed under father's occupation. U.S. military, stationed Camp Carroll. Mother's name, Ward Yoonji. Ward. Her family name. The name she'd always been told was common enough not to mean anything specific. Generic enough that its presence in Korea was pure coincidence. No, Alina whispered. But even as she denied it, pieces were falling into place with horrible precision. Her grandmother's mysterious time in Korea during the 1960s. The old photos she'd found once showing a young Korean woman she'd been told was just a friend. The way her grandmother had reacted when Alina announced she was moving to Korea. That strange mixture of fear and something else she couldn't identify. Jaemin's face had gone white as paper. Where did you get that? Someone just sent it to me, Alina said, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. Someone who wants me to know. She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't voice the implication that was too impossible, too dramatic, too much like something from a television drama to be real. But Jaemin was staring at the document like it was a weapon pointed at his chest, and his expression confirmed what she didn't want to believe. My mother, he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him physically, was adopted by a Korean family after being abandoned by her American father when he was transferred back to the States. She never knew her American family, never had any connection to them. He stopped, his breathing becoming rapid, shallow. I never investigated because it didn't matter. The past was past. But someone investigated, Alina said. Someone dug into both our family histories and found what? That we're related? She couldn't say it. Couldn't voice the word that would make this situation evolve from complicated to impossible. Another message arrived, this time to both their phones simultaneously. Cousins, actually. Second cousins, to be precise. Which makes this whole protection arrangement much more interesting, doesn't it? Mr. Han has been protecting family without knowing it. Miss Ward has been trusting family without realizing it. And now you both have to decide. Does this information change anything? Does blood matter when it was hidden for so long? Does family obligation apply when neither of you chose this connection? Below that, a final line that made Alina's stomach turn. You have 24 hours to decide how you want to proceed, together or separately. Under Mr. Han's protection, or under new arrangements, we're prepared to offer Miss Ward. Choose wisely. Some families are worth preserving. Others are better left in the past where they can't complicate the present. Alina looked at Jaemin, at this man who might be her cousin, who'd been manipulating her life, who'd protected her without her knowledge, who'd been carrying burdens she'd never seen, because she'd been too focused on her own struggles to notice his. and she realized that she didn't know what she felt. Not anger, not relief, not gratitude, not betrayal. Just a vast, overwhelming uncertainty that stretched in every direction like fog, obscuring any clear path forward. "What do we do?" she asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. Jameen looked at her with eyes that held the same uncertainty, the same lost quality she heard in her own question. "I don't know," he said. "For the first time since all of this started, I genuinely don't know what the right choice is." And somehow that honesty, that admission of vulnerability, was more terrifying than any threat, any revelation, any truth they'd uncovered so far. Because if Jamin didn't know how to fix this, then maybe there was no fix to be found. In the end, stories like Alina's remind us that the quietest crossroads in life often carry the heaviest weight. Sometimes protection feels like a gift, and other times it feels like a cage we never agreed to enter. Yet we all face moments where the path forward demands courage we do not know we possess. If you were in her place, would you have trusted the outstretched hand, or stepped into the uncertainty alone? Would you have chosen safety, or chosen freedom, even when both came with a cost? What lingers after her story is not a simple lesson, but a mirror. It asks us what we are willing to accept in order to feel seen, and what we might risk to reclaim our own voice. When the world decides who we are before we can speak, do we surrender the narrative or rewrite it on our own terms? And maybe the real question is this: when destiny stands at your door, whispering a truth you never asked to hear, do you walk away, or do you dare to stay, knowing everything might change?